Imagine walking into a store next year and seeing your favorite products with price tags 25% higher than today. This economic forecast follows Trump's worldwide tariffs announcement that economists warn could trigger a global trade war. Let me show you how these tariffs will impact everything from your morning coffee to your next car purchase. We'll examine the historical precedent from 1930 when similar policies crashed the economy, analyze what's different in today's interconnected world, and most importantly, provide practical strategies to prepare your finances before these changes hit your wallet. The similarities to past economic challenges may surprise you. The economic nightmare of 1930. Did you know that the last time America tried massive tariffs, our economy basically collapsed? Let's rewind to 1930. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act wasn't just any old policy change. It was economic dynamite wrapped in good intentions. America was already wobbling on shaky economic legs when Republican Senator Reed Smoot and Representative Willis Hawley thought they'd save the day with what seemed like a simple fix. Slap huge tariffs on imports to protect American businesses and workers. The economy was starting to show signs of trouble, and they believed higher tariffs would keep American money in American pockets. Here's what's wild. Over 1,000 economists, yes, you heard that right, 1,000, signed a petition practically begging President Hoover not to sign this thing. They were waving red flags and setting off alarm bells, warning that it would cause an economic disaster. But did politicians listen to these experts? Nope. They pushed ahead anyway, convinced they knew better than all those pesky economists with their fancy knowledge and data. The public ate it up too. The promises sounded amazing. Protect American jobs, boost American manufacturing, and stick it to foreign competitors. Who wouldn't want that? Politicians toured factory towns making bold claims about how tariffs would revitalize industries and create jobs. Newspaper editorials cheered on the effort. Workers believed their jobs would be safer. Average Americans supported it because on paper, it looked like a patriotic economic rescue plan. What happened when good intentions collided with economic reality? Total economic catastrophe. Within just a couple years, both imports and exports plummeted by a jaw-dropping 67%. Like a house of cards in a windstorm, 2/3 of America's international trade simply collapsed. The Smoot-Hawley tariff transformed what might have been a regular recession into the Great Depression. Why such devastation? Other countries responded swiftly and decisively. More than 25 countries immediately retaliated with their own tariffs against American goods. Canada, our friendly neighbor, struck first with tariffs on 16 American products that accounted for 30% of U.S. exports to them. Great Britain, France, Germany. One by one, they all raised barriers against American products. The impact on American trade was immediate and severe. Before Smoot-Hawley, America's international trade was humming along. After, the graph resembled a cliff edge. American farmers who relied on selling their crops overseas suddenly couldn't find buyers. Factories that needed imported materials saw their costs skyrocket. It created a vicious cycle where everyone ended up poorer. The numbers tell a devastating story. American car exports fell by over 80% in just 3 years. Agricultural exports, a huge part of our economy back then, collapsed. A farmer in Iowa who used to ship wheat to Europe suddenly had nowhere to sell it. A factory in Pennsylvania that made tools couldn't afford the raw materials it needed. And consumers? They got hit with higher prices for everything from food to clothing. Could the same happen in today's economy? The parallels to our current situation are concerning. Back then, they had emerging technologies changing industries, wealth inequality, and global trade tensions. Today, we're dealing with post-pandemic supply chain issues, inflation concerns, and economic uncertainty, eerily similar conditions to the pre-depression era. What made the Smoot-Hawley tariff so destructive? It created the perfect economic storm with multiple reinforcing factors. First, retaliatory tariffs immediately shut down markets for American products. Second, the trade collapse forced businesses to lay off workers, increasing unemployment and reducing consumer spending. Third, higher prices on imported goods meant American consumers could afford less, further reducing demand. Finally, financial uncertainty caused banks to restrict lending, making it harder for businesses to weather the storm. Like dominoes cascading down, these effects amplified each other. By 1933, unemployment had skyrocketed to 25%. meaning 1 in 4 Americans couldn't find work. Manufacturing output had fallen by a third. It took years, and eventually a World War II, pull us out of the economic hole that these tariffs helped dig. The lesson was so painful that it completely transformed American trade policy for generations. After World War II, America led the charge for lower tariffs and more open trade, recognizing that the Smoot-Hawley approach had been a catastrophic mistake. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade (GATT), and later the World Trade Organization (WTO), were created specifically to prevent this kind of tariff war. Even President Hoover harbored serious doubts about the legislation before signing it. Privately, he described the Smoot-Hawley Act as vicious, extortionate, and obnoxious, yet ultimately caved to political pressure and approved it anyway. This stark contradiction highlights how sometimes politicians make economic decisions based on politics rather than sound policy, with regular people paying the price. Some economists argue that beyond the immediate trade collapse, the most lasting damage was the destruction of trust in the global trading system. Once countries started retaliating against each other, cooperation became nearly impossible, and rebuilding that trust took decades. The economic barriers created by this tit-for-tat tariff war made the global economic recovery much slower and more painful than it needed to be. Trump's tariff plan explained. Fast forward nearly a century, and tariffs are back on the table in a way that would make even Smoot and Hawley raise their eyebrows. What happens when the world's largest economy suddenly decides to tax practically everything coming through its borders? The numbers are staggering, and they could change everything about how you shop. Let's get specific about Trump's tariff proposal, because this represents potentially the biggest trade shakeup in modern American history. The plan calls for a universal 10% tariff on all imports from every country in the world. Your French wines, Japanese cars, Mexican avocados, Korean smartphones, all taxed. For China specifically, Trump has proposed increasing existing tariffs from their current levels, between 7.5% and 25% on about $370 billion worth of goods, up to 60% on everything they export to America. Chinese-made electronics, clothing, furniture, all facing potential price hikes that would strain consumer wallets. Canada and Mexico would get hit with a 25% tariff on most imports, despite being our biggest trading partners under the USMCA trade agreement. That's significant considering we import over $400 billion from each country annually. Plus, there's an additional 10% tax specifically on Canadian energy imports. To understand the magnitude, compare Trump's first term, targeted tariffs on $350 billion of goods, mostly from China. A new proposal, potential tariffs on $3 trillion worth of imports globally. Previous approach, surgical, focused on specific products and countries. New approach, broad, affecting virtually everything Americans purchase. Consider Maria, a middle-class mother in Ohio. Under these tariffs, her family's budget would face pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Her Samsung smartphone replacement costs more. Her children's Nike shoes, manufactured in Vietnam, jump in price, and even groceries like bananas and coffee see increases. For families like hers, these aren't abstract economic policies, they're real household budget constraints. The administration's stated goals include addressing trade imbalances, protecting American businesses from foreign competition, and incentivizing domestic manufacturing. But history offers caution. When Trump imposed tariffs on washing machines in 2018, a University of Chicago study found that while some manufacturing jobs were created, American consumers paid about $1.5 billion more annually for washers and dryers, approximately $820,000 per job created. The timing makes economists particularly nervous. With the economy still recovering from pandemic-induced inflation and supply chains remaining fragile, broad tariffs could worsen existing pressures. Mark Zandi of Moody's Analytics predicts these tariffs could reduce GDP growth by 0.7 percentage points in the first year and eliminate nearly 1 million jobs. The Peterson Institute estimates American households could face additional costs of $1,700 to $3,900 per year. Retaliation compounds these concerns. Other countries won't simply absorb these costs. The European Union has already drafted plans for retaliatory tariffs targeting $10 billion in American exports. China has previously targeted American farmers with precision during the first trade war. Even Canada and Mexico have signaled they would respond with their own tariffs. This matters because tariffs are essentially a tax paid by American importers, not foreign countries. Those costs get passed to American consumers through higher prices. When you hear we're taxing China, what that actually means is we're taxing Americans who buy Chinese products. The manufacturing revival narrative also deserves scrutiny. Many manufacturing jobs that left decades ago aren't returning regardless of tariffs. They've been automated or require specialized infrastructure that would take years to build. During Trump's first term, his 25% tariffs on Chinese goods led to some manufacturing shifts, but mostly to other Asian countries, not back to America. A Federal Reserve study found that the 2018 to 2019 tariffs actually reduced manufacturing employment and increased producer prices. Implementation details remain crucial. Would these tariffs activate all at once or gradually? Would certain industries receive exemptions? These specifics matter enormously for businesses planning ahead and for consumers anticipating price increases. Financial markets, which prefer certainty, would likely respond with volatility. Industries dependent on imports or exports could see share prices decline. Retirement accounts might experience substantial impacts as markets adjust to this new reality. The recession question looms large. By simultaneously increasing consumer prices, disrupting supply chains, provoking retaliatory tariffs, and creating uncertainty, conditions become ripe for economic contraction. The Federal Reserve would face a dilemma: raise interest rates to fight tariff-induced inflation, or lower them to combat economic slowdown. These concerns mirror what happened during the Smoot-Hawley era, when well-intentioned protectionist policies deepened an economic crisis. The historical parallel matters because it demonstrates how global trade barriers can trigger chain reactions with devastating consequences. Then, as potentially now, measures designed to protect American industries ended up harming the broader economy. The stakes for average Americans couldn't be higher. Every shopping trip, from groceries to electronics to clothing, could become more expensive. Every business that relies on imported components faces hard choices about raising prices or cutting costs elsewhere. And every export-dependent job becomes vulnerable to foreign retaliation. Your grocery bill is about to explode. Those abstract economic policies we've been discussing, they're about to show up in the most personal place possible, your refrigerator. The average American family could soon be paying an extra $500 to $1,000 annually just for the same groceries they buy today. Your supermarket receipt is becoming ground zero for international trade policy, and your wallet is directly in the crossfire. Let's talk about that jar of pasta sauce you grab every week without a second thought. Right now, it might cost you $3.99. After these tariffs kick in, you're looking at $4.79 or more. That 20% jump happens because the label might say, Made in USA. But the tomatoes could be from Mexico, the olive oil from Italy, the spices from various global sources, and the glass jar components from China. Each ingredient faces a tariff that compounds into that final sticker price. This affects your entire grocery cart. That bunch of bananas from Central America, up 15%. Avocados from Mexico. Prepare for a 25% jump. Fresh berries during winter months from Chile might increase by 22%. Even your coffee faces significant price hikes. These increases force families to recalculate their entire food budget weekly. Economists at Michigan State University project that most imported foods will see price increases that exceed the actual tariff percentage because of additional supply chain disruptions. These tariffs hit hardest on the stuff that's actually good for you. Fresh fruits and vegetables top the list of foods expected to see the biggest price jumps. According to food economists at Cornell University, produce prices could rise by 15 to 30% depending on seasonality and origin. Americans already struggle to afford the recommended daily servings of fruits and vegetables. Now it's getting even harder. Meat prices aren't escaping either. While American farmers produce a lot of beef, pork, and chicken domestically, the feed often contains imported components. Plus, the meatpacking industry relies heavily on imported packaging materials. The result? Experts project meat prices rising 10 to 15% within months of tariff implementation. Your pantry staples face immediate price impacts too. Rice, sugar, chocolate, coffee, tea, and spices are predominantly imported. What's especially concerning is how quickly these increases hit the checkout counter. Unlike durable goods, where retailers might absorb some costs temporarily, grocery stores typically pass food price increases to consumers within weeks. Even products considered American-made aren't immune because of hidden tariffs throughout the supply chain. Take bread. Kansas wheat might be harvested with machinery containing imported parts, baked with equipment having components from Germany or Japan, and wrapped in imported packaging materials. These costs cascade until they reach your shopping cart. Consider the Martinez family from Ohio. With 3 growing teenagers, they've already seen their weekly grocery bill climb from $220 to $275 over the past year. We're cutting back on meat, buying more pasta, and I've started growing tomatoes and peppers, says Elena Martinez. But winter is coming, and we can't grow anything then. This highlights the seasonal complexity. During summer, you might buy local produce to avoid some price hikes, but come winter, when 70% of fresh fruits and up to 40% of vegetables are imported, your grocery bill really feels the pinch. Agricultural economists predict winter produce prices could spike 25 to 35% above normal seasonal increases. The timing makes this particularly painful. Food prices have already been climbing faster than overall inflation for the past 3 years. The USDA's Economic Research Service reports that grocery prices are up 25% since 2020. Adding tariff-induced price hikes on top of already elevated food costs creates a double whammy for household budgets already stretched thin. A typical family of 4 currently spends about $250 to $300 weekly on groceries. Post-tariffs, that same cart jumps to $290 to $360, an extra $160 to $240 monthly or up to $2,880 annually. Economic models from the Urban Institute suggest the actual increase might be $500 to $1,000 per year because people will change their buying habits, switching to cheaper options, buying less, or eliminating certain items altogether. This is where the inequality of tariffs becomes painfully clear. 4 wealthy households spending just 10% of their income on food. Absorbing these increases is annoying but manageable. 4 lower-income families already dedicating 30 to 35% of their budget to groceries? It's potentially catastrophic. Research from the University of Pennsylvania shows families in the bottom 20% of income will experience a 5.5% reduction in purchasing power compared to just 1.9% for the top 20%, because necessities like food make up a much larger percentage of their total spending. The retail response is already beginning. Major grocery chains are accelerating their private label expansions, wholesale clubs report surging membership applications, and food banks are preparing for increased demand just as their own costs rise. Companies are getting creative with shrinkflation, keeping prices the same but reducing package sizes. That 16-ounce cereal box might shrink to 14 ounces, but stay at the same price point. There are strategic moves you can make. Stocking up on non-perishables before prices rise makes financial sense. Buying locally produced foods helps avoid some tariff impacts. Learning to cook with affordable, domestic ingredients can partially offset the damage. But these strategies require time, knowledge, and often upfront cash. Resources not equally available across income levels. For restaurants and food service businesses, these cost increases create impossible choices between raising prices, absorbing costs, or substituting ingredients. Many analysts predict a wave of restaurant closures, particularly among independent establishments already operating on thin margins. Remember when grocery shopping was just an errand and not an exercise in global economics? Those days are gone. Each aisle now represents a different lesson in international trade, with your grocery budget taking the final exam. Electronics, clothes, and cars, the price tag shock. That appetizer of higher food prices? Well, now it's time for the main course, and your wallet's about to feel the real pain. Your entire household budget is on the chopping block when these tariffs hit. Let's get real about what's coming for literally everything else you buy. You know that smartphone in your pocket? The one that already costs a small fortune? It's about to get even pricier. Your typical smartphone contains components from at least 43 different countries, with parts like processors from Taiwan, displays from South Korea, cameras from Japan, and batteries from China. When tariffs hit all those countries, that sleek device transforms into a perfect storm of price increases. Industry analysts at IDC project that smartphone prices could jump by 15 to 25% almost immediately after tariffs take effect. That $1,000 iPhone will cost you $1,150 to $1,250 instead. The ripple effect extends to your entire tech ecosystem. Laptops could see price hikes of $150 to $300, while gaming consoles might cost an extra $75 to $150. What makes electronics particularly vulnerable is their complex manufacturing infrastructure. As tech analyst Ming-Chi Kuo notes, even American tech giants like Apple can't simply move production to avoid these tariffs. The ecosystem of suppliers doesn't exist elsewhere at the necessary scale. This reality means consumers have few options to escape these increases. Your living room tech faces similar fate. Consumer Reports data shows TV prices are expected to rise 10 to 20%, with larger models seeing the biggest jumps. That 65-inch smart TV you've been eyeing for $800 will soon cost $960. Analysts expect retailers to slash holiday discounts by half compared to previous years, eliminating traditional savings opportunities many families rely on. The clothes in your closet aren't immune either. The American Apparel and Footwear Association reports that a staggering 97% of clothes sold in America are imported. Clothing imports from China alone totaled $27 billion last year, with Bangladesh, Vietnam, and India adding billions more. With 25% tariffs hitting these countries, economists at Moody's predict clothing prices will jump 20 to 30% across the board. These increases will be particularly painful for families with children, explains retail analyst Dana Thomas. Kids outgrow clothes so quickly that parents can't simply wait out the price hikes. They'll face these increased costs repeatedly throughout the year. A typical family of 4 could see their annual clothing budget increase by $500 to $800, forcing difficult choices between necessities and wants. Some brands will try absorbing costs initially, but industry experts predict most will pass along at least 80% of tariff costs to consumers within 3 to 6 months. Higher-end brands might maintain prices but reduce quality, using thinner fabrics, fewer details, cheaper buttons, in what industry insiders call quality deflation. Your transportation costs will surge too. Even American-made vehicles contain parts from at least 15 different countries. The Center for Automotive Research estimates that tariffs would add $2,000 to $6,000 to the price of a new vehicle, depending on the model. A Ford F-150 might be assembled in Michigan, but its transmission could come from Mexico, electronics from China, and steel from South Korea. Each component hit with tariffs. Used car prices will follow, rising 10 to 15% within months of tariff implementation as buyers seek alternatives to expensive new vehicles. The $18,000 used sedan you've been considering will cost $20,000 plus instead, putting reliable transportation further out of reach for many working families. Your home itself is filled with imported goods facing price hikes. According to Furniture Today, furniture imports would see 20% plus price increases. Kitchen appliances are projected to rise 15 to 25%, with refrigerators potentially costing $200 to $500 more and washing machines rising by $100 to $200. Economist Diane Swank of Grant Thornton explains, "What makes these increases especially painful is their timing. They hit just as many households were hoping inflation would finally cool off. Instead, consumers face a whole new wave of price increases across virtually all spending categories. Even construction materials face tariffs, making home repairs and renovations more expensive. A typical kitchen renovation could cost $3,000 to $5,000 more, while bathroom updates might rise by $1,500 to $2,500. For homeowners already struggling with high mortgage rates, these additional costs could force many to delay necessary maintenance. When combining these increases with grocery price hikes, the average American household is looking at spending an additional $2,000 to $4,000 annually. Lower and middle-income families will feel the squeeze most acutely. According to economic modeling from the Tax Foundation, these tariffs would effectively function as a regressive tax, taking a larger percentage of income from lower-earning households. The timing makes this particularly challenging for many families. A recent Federal Reserve survey found that 37% of Americans don't have $400 in emergency savings. These price increases could force many to take on credit card debt just to maintain their current standard of living. Budget-conscious consumers might try shopping at discount stores, but even retailers like Dollar Tree and Walmart import most of their merchandise. Their razor-thin margins leave less room to absorb tariff costs, potentially leading to even larger percentage price increases. The global nature of these tariffs means there's nowhere for manufacturers to hide. Previous tariffs targeted specific countries, allowing companies to shift production elsewhere. These worldwide tariffs would hit almost every major manufacturing hub simultaneously. The jobs myth versus reality. As these staggered price increases gradually hit your wallet, the biggest selling point for these economic sacrifices is that sweet manufacturing job boom waiting just around the corner. But here's the million-dollar question. If we've literally tried this exact same experiment before, why aren't we talking about what actually happened to American jobs the last time? The promise sounds amazing. Slap tariffs on imports, force companies to manufacture here instead of overseas, and watch good-paying factory jobs come flooding back to American communities. This compelling story resonates with many Americans who've watched manufacturing towns struggle for decades. However, the data from Trump's first round of tariffs in 2018 to 2019 tells a starkly different story. When economists at the Federal Reserve analyzed the aftermath of those first tariffs, they discovered American manufacturing actually lost jobs. Their study tracked employment in industries directly protected by tariffs against similar industries without protection. The protected sectors gained some jobs initially, but these gains were overwhelmed by massive job losses in sectors dependent on imported materials. The math was brutal. For every job created in steel and aluminum production, about 16 jobs vanished in industries using those materials. One new steelworker job came at the cost of 16 other manufacturing positions at companies suddenly facing much higher costs for their raw materials. Consider Mary Buchseiger, CEO of Michigan-based Lucerne International, an auto parts manufacturer. When tariffs drove steel and aluminum prices up 30%, her company faced an impossible situation. We couldn't absorb those costs overnight, and we couldn't instantly rebuild our supply chain, she explained. The result? Layoffs and cancellation of an expansion that would have created 140 new American jobs. More than 40 other U.S. steel-consuming companies reported similar cutbacks. Even apparent success stories reveal troubling patterns. Whirlpool added about 200 jobs at their Ohio factories following washing machine tariffs. But those jobs cost American consumers $1.5 billion in higher prices, over $800,000 per job created. Moreover, these positions were highly automated, bearing little resemblance to the labor-intensive factory work of the past. The Carrier air conditioning plant in Indiana demonstrates this pattern. After receiving tax incentives to keep jobs from moving to Mexico, they automated many positions. The 800 jobs initially saved shrank to fewer than 300 within 2 years. This highlights an uncomfortable reality. When manufacturing returns to American soil, automation ensures it brings far fewer jobs than promised. The broader impact across industries tells an even more concerning story. Solar tariffs led to 62,000 lost jobs and $19 billion in canceled investments, according to the Solar Energy Industries Association. While tariffs protected the 20% of solar jobs in manufacturing, they severely damaged the 80% in installation, sales, and project development. The reshoring narrative also falls apart under scrutiny. A Moody's Analytics study found that for every company that returned production to America, roughly 3 others simply relocated to different foreign countries like Vietnam, Mexico, or Malaysia. During the peak of the first tariff round in 2019, manufacturing employment grew by just 0.4%, slower than overall job growth in the economy. These minimal gains disappeared entirely when the pandemic hit. American manufacturers, already struggling with higher tariff-induced costs, had less financial cushion to weather COVID disruptions. Looking at the total employment impact, economists at the Trade Partnership estimated that tariffs and retaliatory measures led to a net loss of nearly 300,000 American jobs across all sectors. Ironically, the hardest-hit states were Michigan, Texas, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, some of the very regions the tariffs were politically designed to help. Tom Sullivan, a third-generation machine operator from Saginaw, Michigan, exemplifies this impact. When the steel prices went up, our orders dropped by half. After 18 years at the plant, I got laid off along with 40 others. The factory making the steel might have hired a few people, but our whole shop got gutted, he recounts. Could broader tariffs succeed where targeted ones failed? Some economists, like Peter Navarro, argue that universal tariffs would level the playing field. However, most independent analyses identify a fundamental issue. Modern manufacturing creates fewer jobs regardless of location due to automation and technology. General Motors' newest electric vehicle battery plant in Ohio illustrates this reality. This $2.3 billion investment will employ just 1,100 workers when fully operational, about a third of the workforce that occupied the same factory space in the 1970s. Manufacturing jobs in 2024 require different skills, offer different wages, and exist in vastly fewer numbers than those of 1974. This reveals the core myth. The promise isn't merely that manufacturing will return to America, but that manufacturing jobs of the past will return. Manufacturing output in America has actually grown over decades while employment declined because automation means each worker produces far more than before. Another overlooked factor: worker training and education. Even when manufacturers expand in America, they struggle to find workers with technical skills needed for modern factory work. Deloitte found that 2.1 million manufacturing jobs could go unfilled through 2030 due to this skills gap. Tariffs don't address this fundamental mismatch. The evidence suggests tariffs primarily create jobs in directly protected industries, but these gains are overwhelmed by losses in industries using those products, export sectors hit by retaliatory tariffs, and consumer industries affected by reduced household spending due to higher prices. The global trade war has already started. Those retaliatory tariffs aren't just theoretical economic consequences. They're already being meticulously crafted in government offices from Ottawa to Beijing. While Americans are still debating the domestic impact of Trump's tariff plan, our trading partners have been busy designing their economic revenge with surgical precision. From North America to Asia, our global trading map is lighting up with carefully crafted response plans. In North America, Canada has identified over 100 American products worth approximately $25 billion that would face immediate counter tariffs, a figure representing roughly 8% of total U.S. exports to Canada that would directly impact consumer prices. Their strategy targets politically sensitive regions. Wisconsin cheese, Michigan auto parts, and Pennsylvania steel products feature prominently on their list. Canadian officials have privately told reporters they're not messing around this time, after their experience with previous trade disputes. Across the Pacific, China's Ministry of Commerce has assembled an extensive retaliation package targeting American agricultural exports like soybeans, hitting farmers in Iowa, Nebraska, and other traditional Republican strongholds. Their plan extends to American technology companies with significant operations in Democratic-leaning states like California and Washington, creating a bipartisan pressure point designed to maximize political impact. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, European Union trade officials have drafted plans imposing tariffs on $10 to $15 billion of American exports, focusing on Kentucky bourbon, Wisconsin motorcycles, and Florida orange juice. A senior EU trade representative recently commented, "We've learned from previous disputes that targeted pressure is most effective at changing policy positions." This European strategy connects directly to American dinner tables and shopping carts, potentially raising consumer prices on imported goods while simultaneously reducing American export opportunities. The precision of these retaliatory measures reveals modern trade warfare's sophistication. Japan's preliminary list targets American pharmaceutical exports, medical devices, and aerospace components, industries with substantial lobbying power in Washington. South Korea focuses on intermediate goods American manufacturers need for their supply chains, imposing tariffs on specialized electronic components and rare earth minerals to create cascading disruptions. A Korean trade official reportedly told industry leaders they're prepared to show America the interconnected nature of modern manufacturing. These global responses ultimately translate to higher prices and fewer choices for American consumers, as production costs rise and supply chains fragment under trade pressure. The long-term concern for American businesses lies in permanent market loss. During previous trade disputes, American soybean farmers lost significant market share in China as buyers shifted to Brazilian suppliers. Once trade relationships redirect, they rarely fully return. A study by the American Farm Bureau found that after previous tariff disputes were resolved, American farmers only recovered about 60% of their previous export volumes. Kentucky distillers experienced similar challenges with whiskey exports to Europe, seeing sales drop by over 35%. Even after tariffs were lifted, they struggled to regain market position as European consumers discovered alternatives from Ireland, Scotland, and Japan. The CEO of a major Kentucky distillery commented, "Once you lose shelf space in international markets, getting it back is 10 times harder than keeping it in the first place." Technology exports face comparable risks. American cloud providers could see European clients shift to local alternatives under retaliatory measures. The EU has been pushing for digital sovereignty, and trade tensions would accelerate this trend. Once a company migrates its digital infrastructure to a new provider, switching back becomes extremely costly. As countries implement retaliatory measures, others often follow with their own restrictions, creating a multiplier effect. Mexico might start with targeted tariffs on American corn and pork, but could expand to more products if tensions escalate. This network effect can transform a bilateral dispute into a global trade war where American exports face barriers in multiple markets simultaneously. Modern trade retaliation occurs with unprecedented speed. Countries have pre-prepared contingency plans they can implement within days of a tariff announcement. The digital economy allows for faster targeting of vulnerable sectors as economic modeling becomes more sophisticated. Agricultural exports remain particularly vulnerable. U.S. farmers export roughly 20% of their production, with certain crops like soybeans sending over 50% of their harvest overseas. When China targeted American soybeans previously, prices plummeted by nearly 20%, forcing many farmers to take emergency government assistance. A South Dakota farmer told me, "We're still recovering from the last tariff war, and now we're staring down the barrel of another one." The technology sector appears increasingly vulnerable this round. Countries have identified American technology exports as prime targets, including semiconductor equipment and cloud computing services. The Information Technology Industry Council estimates American tech companies could lose $15 to $20 billion in annual exports under full retaliatory measures. Energy exports also face significant risk. American LNG exports to Europe could face new barriers, just as European countries seek to diversify energy supplies. American oil exports to Asia could encounter similar restrictions. The strategic precision of these measures targets swing state economies. Chinese strategy reportedly identified electoral vulnerability metrics for American exports, prioritizing products from states with close electoral margins. The EU's approach similarly focuses on products from battleground states like Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Manufacturing states face particular vulnerability. When the EU targeted Harley-Davidson previously, the company shifted some production overseas, costing American jobs. A manufacturing executive in Ohio commented, "We export 30% of what we make." If those markets impose retaliatory tariffs, we're looking at potential layoffs, not hiring. The current situation creates a self-reinforcing cycle. As countries implement retaliatory tariffs, domestic pressure grows for additional protectionist measures. Trade disputes beginning with targeted products can quickly expand to entire sectors. Historical examples suggest this cycle typically continues until economic pain forces recalibration, usually after significant damage has occurred. The supply chain earthquake. That escalating spiral of tariffs is triggering a seismic shift in how products actually reach your home. The global manufacturing map is being completely redrawn as we speak, and this reshuffling will fundamentally transform what you buy and where it comes from. Companies are already making major moves behind the scenes. Think about your smartphone for a second. That single device contains components from dozens of different countries, assembled in multiple factories before landing in your pocket. This intricate dance of parts and assembly is now being completely reconfigured. What we're seeing is something supply chain experts call tariff engineering, the corporate art of restructuring operations specifically to avoid getting hit with these new costs. It's essentially a massive game of economic hopscotch, where businesses are desperately trying to jump around tariff landmines. When companies face a 25% tariff increase on goods from China or Mexico, they immediately start looking for alternative manufacturing locations in countries not targeted by these measures. Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, and India are seeing massive influxes of manufacturing investment as companies scramble to relocate. Take footwear giant Nike as an example. During previous tariff threats, they accelerated their already-in-progress shift away from China. Today, Vietnam produces more Nike shoes than China does. This wasn't a patriotic move to bring jobs back to America. It was a calculated business decision to maintain profit margins by finding the next lowest cost producer. The same pattern played out with electronics manufacturer Samsung, which shifted significant production from China to Vietnam in response to previous trade tensions. They didn't move those jobs to America. They simply relocated them to another Asian country with competitive labor costs and no tariff penalties. This reshuffling of the global manufacturing deck is happening across virtually every product category. Furniture makers move to Indonesia and the Philippines. Apparel production shifts to Bangladesh and Cambodia. Electronics manufacturing relocates to Malaysia and Thailand. Companies are getting creative with supply chain restructuring. Some are splitting their production across multiple countries to avoid having too much concentration in any single location. Others are breaking manufacturing into smaller steps performed in different countries to navigate around country-specific tariffs. Let me show you how this works with a real-world example. Imagine a typical lamp that used to be manufactured entirely in China. Now, the metal base might be made in Vietnam, the electrical components in Malaysia, the lampshade in Cambodia, with final assembly happening in Thailand, all to avoid Chinese origin tariffs. This product travels thousands of additional miles, creates more transportation emissions, and ultimately costs more, but technically avoids being labeled as made in China. Even American companies that proudly tout their Made in USA labels are scrambling. Why? Because many of their components and raw materials come from overseas. A furniture manufacturer in North Carolina might use American wood, but the specialized screws, hinges, and finishing materials could come from Mexico or China, all subject to these new tariffs. The clean energy sector is particularly vulnerable to these supply chain disruptions. Solar panel manufacturing depends heavily on components and materials from Asia. In fact, about 80% of solar panel materials originate from China. When previous solar tariffs were implemented, prices jumped by 30%, installations declined by 10%, and an estimated 62,000 American installation jobs were lost, all while Chinese manufacturers simply shifted assembly to other Asian countries. Electric vehicle production faces similar challenges. The batteries that power these vehicles require specialized minerals and components from global supply chains. Disrupting these chains makes the end products significantly more expensive or even temporarily unavailable. What's particularly concerning is how these supply chain shifts become permanent. Business executives understand that investing millions in new factories and supply chains isn't something you do temporarily. Once a company moves production from China to Vietnam, they typically don't move it back when trade tensions ease. These are permanent reconfigurations of global manufacturing. While these tariffs aim to bring manufacturing back to America, the reality is quite different. Companies that do move operations often choose automation over hiring American workers. A factory that might have employed 500 workers in China might only need 50 highly skilled technicians to operate an automated facility in the U.S. According to a recent Oxford economics study, only about 10% of companies that left China due to previous tariffs relocated to the United States. The vast majority moved to other Asian countries. This pattern is expected to continue with these new, broader tariffs. Corporate decision-makers are increasingly viewing diversification as the safest strategy. Rather than concentrating production in either China or America, they're spreading manufacturing across multiple countries to create tariff-proof supply chains. This approach minimizes exposure to any single country's trade policies, but adds complexity and often cost. The technology sector provides a fascinating case study. Apple has been gradually shifting some production out of China, not just because of tariffs, but also to reduce concentration risk. However, they haven't moved production primarily to the US. They've expanded in India, Vietnam, and other Asian countries. The economics simply don't support large-scale electronics manufacturing returning to America, even with significant tariffs. What does all this mean for you as a consumer? First, you'll likely see less product variety as companies simplify their offerings to manage more complex supply chains. Second, product quality may become less consistent as manufacturing shifts to new locations with different quality control systems. Third, prices will increase not just because of the tariffs themselves, but because of the additional costs associated with completely reconfiguring global supply networks. For American workers, the impact is mixed at best. Some manufacturing jobs may return, particularly in sectors requiring specialized skills or proximity to American consumers. However, most companies responding to tariffs will either automate American operations or shift production to third countries, leaving our economic resilience vulnerable to the very global disruptions these policies aim to prevent. Your Financial Protection Plan, Part 1. The reshuffling of global manufacturing isn't just a corporate problem. It's about to hit your household budget like a financial earthquake. What if I told you the emergency fund calculator you've been using is dangerously outdated for? What's coming, and the time to fix it isn't after prices spike, but right now. Consider Sarah, a teacher who ignored warnings about tariff impacts until she needed an emergency furnace replacement. When prices jumped 20% overnight, her carefully calculated emergency fund fell devastatingly short. This scenario is playing out across America as standard financial advice fails to account for our changing economic landscape. Let's be real. That standard advice about keeping 3 to 6 months of expenses saved for emergencies was created for normal economic conditions. With these tariffs rolling out, your emergency fund needs a serious upgrade before inflation renders it insufficient. Think about it. If your monthly expenses are currently $4,000, a traditional emergency fund might have you saving $12,000 to $24,000. But when prices increase across the board, that same financial cushion covers fewer months of expenses. Your 6-month safety net could quickly shrink to just 4 or 5 months of protection. Financial advisors now recommend a tariff vulnerability assessment to personalize your emergency savings target. Here's how to calculate yours. Review your last 3 months of spending and categorize every purchase. Identify categories with high import percentages: electronics, clothing, furniture, appliances, certain foods. Calculate your monthly spending in these vulnerable categories. Apply projected 15 to 20% price increases to determine your additional monthly needs. For example, if you spend $800 monthly on groceries, $200 on clothing, and $300 on imported goods, that's $1,300 of potentially vulnerable spending. With projected increases of 15 to 20%, you'd need an extra $195 to $260 monthly to maintain your current lifestyle. This is why financial planners recommend an emergency fund boost of 15 to 20% above your traditional target. If your current goal was $18,000, your new tariff-adjusted target should be around $21,600. That extra buffer provides essential protection against coming price shocks. Timing is crucial. Building cash reserves now before prices climb gives you significantly more purchasing power. Every dollar saved today buys more than after tariffs take effect. This matters especially for households living paycheck to paycheck. A financialbuffers.com survey found 52% of Americans would struggle with an unexpected $1,000 expense even before these price hikes. That percentage jumps to 68% when factoring in projected increases. We're telling clients to prioritize liquid savings over nearly everything else right now, says financial planner Rebecca Walden. The window to prepare is closing quickly, and cash reserves provide immediate protection. Your targets should reflect your household's specific vulnerabilities. Families with children typically have higher exposure to imported goods. Households in rental properties may face steeper rent increases as landlords pass along higher costs. Medical supplies, hobby materials, and even pet products are vulnerable categories many overlook when calculating their exposure. For young adults or recent graduates, the recommendation is more aggressive. Aim for 25 to 30% above standard targets. This demographic typically spends a higher percentage of income on imported consumer goods with fewer established financial reserves. Small business owners and freelancers face double exposure, both personally and professionally. If your business relies on imported materials, you'll need separate cash reserves to absorb higher inventory costs before adjusting pricing strategies. To find extra money for enhanced emergency funds, start with a spending audit focused on discretionary expenses that won't be directly impacted by tariffs. Consider a tariff preparation sprint, a 60 to 90-day period of intensified saving. This might involve temporarily pausing retirement contributions above employer match levels or postponing major optional purchases. Side hustles focused on service-based work rather than product sales make particular sense now. Tutoring, consulting, digital content creation, and local services can generate extra cash without exposure to rising import costs. Don't raid your retirement accounts, warns financial educator Maria Gonzalez. The tax penalties and long-term growth you'd sacrifice aren't worth it. Instead, look at temporary lifestyle adjustments that won't compromise your future. For families already struggling, community resources may help. Many credit unions are launching tariff preparedness programs with higher interest rates on emergency savings accounts. Some nonprofits are expanding financial coaching services specifically for navigating inflation periods. Your strategy should account for which expenses might increase first. Energy costs and electronics will likely see the earliest price jumps, while certain clothing categories might take longer as retailers work through existing inventory. An emergency fund provides peace of mind during uncertain times. Research from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau shows that households with adequate emergency savings report 44% lower financial stress levels, even when facing identical economic challenges. Creating separate savings buckets for specific categories likely to see the biggest price jumps is another smart move. A dedicated grocery price buffer, or electronics replacement fund, helps mentally allocate resources for specific needs. When building enhanced emergency funds, prioritize accessibility over yield. While high-yield savings accounts are ideal, the most important factor is quick access without penalties. The emotional component of preparing for price increases is just as important as the financial one. Taking concrete actions like building stronger cash